Hey there gang, I am Blunty, and in my previous video I tore down the new BlackMagic Pocket Cinema Camera from end to end, menu to lens mount. So that means today we get to be all about what the camera generates. We get to go into the nitty gritty of the footage that comes off the card. In this particular video, everything you're going to see was shot with a selection of native Micro Four Thirds lenses in the film picture profile setting in the Prores encoding mode. Mainly because at the time I'm recording this, the option for Cinema DNG RAW video hasn't yet been enabled by a firmware update. Oh, and everything here was shot at 25p, almost always with a 180-degree shutter angle. We're starting out here by showing you the ungraded material. This is how it looks right off the memory card. And at the end of the video, I'll show you some sample grades that I've been messing around with. Some subtle and natural, some with looks much more extreme and dramatic and stylistic. And in future videos, I'll be comparing the internal ProRes codec with material recorded externally from the HDMI port to an Atomos Ninja 2 recorder. There'll also be a video looking exclusively at legacy, fully manual and adapted lenses from other mounts and systems, and a few camera versus camera shootouts. So then, the general experience of shooting with the BlackMagic Pocket Cinema Camera is pretty different from what many of you may be familiar with from your DSLRs and other hybrid and mirrorless systems. It's a very pared down experience. There's no roll auto modes to fall back on. You either know what you're doing or you're going to get ugly garbage. Pretty much as simple as that. And I make no claims to being an expert cinematographer, but if you've a working knowledge of how to operate in manual settings on a more standard camera, it shouldn't take you too long to wrap your head around how the Pocket Cinema Camera wants things done. The image generated is very, very flat. This is, of course, very, very deliberate, and the sensor is capable of delivering a very wide dynamic range, up to 13 stops of latitude, in fact. But you'll really need the Cinema DNG RAW video mode to get the most out of that. But even here in ProRes mode, there's a big slab of playroom. The camera has been designed to deliver as filmic an image as it can, and I feel the BlackMagic team have had some pretty good success with that. Tones are smooth and even. Motion blur with a 180-degree shutter looks very much like the film motion blur that so many people chase in their own productions. There's a very nice amount of detail, but it doesn't have that sort of harsh digital sharpness to it. And it should be noted at this point that just like with the color correction and grading, it is expected that you'll apply your own sharpening in post-production. And if you're coming from a more traditional camera setup, most cameras do this during recording. You have some limited control over how much sharpening they apply, but pretty much all of them apply their own sharpening in camera. But this camera is, of course, for people who want total control over the look of their final image, and that includes sharpening. So, to those unfamiliar with this kind of workflow, the image may indeed look just a bit softer than you're used to seeing come out of most cameras. This is normal, and it is a good thing, believe it or not. Now, two issues being discussed in various forums and comment sections on websites and such in relation to footage and early tests that have already appeared online from the BlackMagic Pocket Cinema Camera are about what's called the white orb issue and the black spot issue. Now, the white orb issue refers to specular highlights and overexposed point light sources having harsh, solid blob-like appearances, instead of tapering off in a gradual, more naturalistic, filmic way. And yes, unfortunately I can confirm this absolutely happens, and it happens regularly and predictably. How much of an issue this is will be up to the end user. For me, it's not a deal breaker. It's generally fairly subtle and can be limited and controlled to some extent by pulling your exposure down just a bit more. And there is usually plenty of dynamic range to rescue your shadows back if you need to do this. And really, if we are honest with each other, only our fellow camera nerds and cinematographers will ever really notice this particular issue. And if the general audience does have the time and brain space to stop and notice that your specular highlights have a bit of a hard edge to them, perhaps you're just not doing your job as a storyteller very well, are you? Yes, I'm sure it will be an issue that will annoy some people, but for me, not a big one. I wish it wasn't there, absolutely, but not a huge issue. Now, the black spot issue is much more severe and something a normal audience member will absolutely notice and will absolutely be distracted by, and that's something you don't want to happen in your footage. The black spot issue is characterized by large overexposed point light sources, like for example the sun, or a large or foreground exposed light bulb or something like that, will generate a big ugly, infuriatingly distracting black spot right in the middle of it. How the camera ever made it out of testing without them noticing or fixing this issue, I will never know. Perhaps they thought it was acceptable. It is not. And again, the only way to attempt to control or avoid this is to underexpose. But in many cases of this issue, you'll usually have to underexpose so much that the majority of the rest of your scene would be unrecoverably dark. In both cases, I tested if this was the sensor at fault or perhaps an encoding issue, and I did this by recording externally and internally simultaneously the exact same footage, and unfortunately the issues appeared in both recordings, so it may very well be an unpatchable hardware issue. Your only option is to be aware that this issue happens and try and avoid using this camera to frame up shots where it would be an issue. And I know when Fujifilm had a very similar issue with one of their X series cameras, they released a firmware update to try and address it, which failed, absolutely, and they wound up having to replace this sensor that they used in the camera entirely, in some cases recalling people's cameras to swap them out for a camera with the new sensor. So whether or not this is fixable in this camera, I don't know. It seems doubtful. But aside from that one relatively minor issue of the white orbs and the one crushingly annoying but kind of avoidable issue of the black spot, the camera performs marvelously in every other regard. There's stonks of latitude to play with, the files are utterly free from compression artifacts and macro blocking and gradient banding and other nasties that can make getting a flat, highly gradable image from a DSLR or regular mirrorless camera very difficult indeed. And I'm not as particularly anal about this stuff as some camera nerds are, but to me it seems to deliver a very natural, organic, film-like image. Pulling manual focus with either or both of the focus peaking options is terrifically easy. The image is very clean at ASA 800 and below, and moving up to 1600 ASA, the top limit of the sensitivity options, you'll get some very fine and mostly monochromatic noise in your image, and while it certainly looks more digital than film grainy, it is much, much finer than Super 16 film grain would be anyway. And add to that the fact that all of this amazing power is delivered to you in a device barely larger than an iPhone, well, it's bewilderingly awesome. So I'll leave you with that and let you make up your own minds, and if you're going to get all film nerdy on me about my colour grading skills, save it. I know, I'm no indie filmmaker, I'm no colour grader, and I usually don't do much, if any, grading with my usual YouTube content. I usually set it up in camera in a picture profile so it comes off the card ready to use for what I need it to do, and I'm well out of practice with proper grading. I'm just hoping that the various examples that I'm showing you are a decent enough selection of subtle to aggressive grading and looks so you can see how well the flat footage copes with it. But thanks for watching. I am Blunty, and I hope this has been helpful. Stay tuned for even more sample footage and various tests and shootouts from the BlackMagic Pocket Cinema Camera, and I'll catch you next time.